one day Jesus is walking down the street and a guy walks up to him and says, Lord, what's the most important command in the Bible? And Jesus said, oh, that's easy. I can summarize the whole Bible in 2 sentences. Love God and love your neighbors yourself. That's it. It's all about love. And right now, the most practical way I can show love for my neighbor is wear a mask.
The federal government used evangelical leaders to spread COVID propaganda. On February 17th, the Biden administration officially named former National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins as the nation's new top science advisor. The appointment came despite the fact that Collins has been under fire since leaked emails suggested he and Anthony Fauci colluded to suppress evidence that COVID originated in a Wuhan lab. It's an issue still undergoing lots of research and debate in the scientific community. Yet in one of the emails, Collins suggests using media connections to try to discredit other medical experts who believe the virus may not have developed naturally. In another, he asks Fauci about news coverage of the lab leak theory and wonders if there's a way to use the media to, quote, help put down this very destructive conspiracy. But Collins and Fauci didn't just rely on the mainstream media to get their messages out to the public. There's also evidence that Collins specifically tapped into his friendships with numerous high-profile pastors and church leaders to further spread the government's COVID narratives. These weren't just messages about getting vaccinated, but also arguing for government vaccine mandates. Collins also used the platforms of his church leader friends to urge pastors to teach their congregations that if they wanted to obey Jesus' command to love their neighbors, then they must comply with government mandates on keeping churches closed and businesses closed and keeping children masked. This is the story of how the Biden administration's new top science advisor, Francis Collins, used evangelical leaders to spread the government's COVID messaging to Christians. When we look at the story of how Francis Collins, an official of the federal government, became the key purveyor of COVID views in evangelical churches, the first question we have to ask, why did major ministries feel compelled to listen to Collins and almost no other medical experts but Collins? The answer lies in Collins's impressive list of character witnesses. Here's a Christianity Today broadcast introducing him to their audience.
I want you all to know that Francis Collins is a follower of Jesus Christ. So tonight you get to hear from someone speaking not only as an expert, but also as a Christian who loves the Lord.
The names of the pastors and organizations who held Collins out as the authoritative voice Christians should listen to during the pandemic are some of the most well-known in American Protestant circles. Christianity Today magazine, the Billy Graham Center, missions expert Ed Stetzer, the Gospel Coalition, Pastor Timothy Keller, theologian N.T. Wright, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Center, Russell Moore. All of them were telling lay Christians in the pews that they should rely on Collins for COVID advice, not just because of his medical expertise, but because, they said, he was a fellow Christian brother. As a Time magazine report detailed, the government had specifically dispatched Collins to make its case to Christians through what it called the Christian intelligentsia. Once church leaders welcomed Collins to their platforms, they joined him in pleading with pastors to use their positions of influence to spread the information to their congregations. Here's Collins talking with the head of the Billy Graham Center, Ed Stetzer.
I guess I want to exhort pastors, once again, to try to use your credibility with your flock to put forward the public health measures that we know can work.
Yeah, no, I agree.
This wasn't just a one-time off-the-cuff request. Collins carried the message that churches and pastors needed to get involved in furthering approved COVID views in every interview he gave to the Christian media. Like this town hall event, hosted by Christianity Today, that included then ERLC head Russell Moore.
The church is a critical player, and church leaders, I just want to call out to you, this is not a time to remain silent. This is a time to be sure you're part of answering the questions, getting the truth out there. Because it's one thing for me, a federal employee, to try to put information forward, and people will naturally go, well, of course he's going to say that. But if they hear that from their pastor or their doctor or somebody at the community center who's really got the information, then I think we've got a better shot.
In all of these media events, none of the Christian luminaries bothered to ask whether it's really a pastor's role to collaborate with the government in spreading COVID messaging. In fact, Stetzer ended one interview with Collins by saying he'd formed a formal partnership with the NIH and the CDC, creating a new website hosted by the Billy Graham Center called coronavirusandthechurch.com. Some major pastors like Rick Warren even joined Collins in pleading with faith leaders to take up the cause of suppressing COVID views federal authorities didn't approve of. Almost no other medical professionals took part in any of this Christian media coverage, but the few that did simply backed up Collins's point of view. And what were Collins's views? Nothing that didn't directly align with the Biden administration's COVID policies. In new exclusive audio obtained by the Daily Wire, Russell Moore told college students that he and Collins have partnered to deal with evangelical resistance to vaccines and mask mandates. The audio came from an event associated with former Obama advisor David Axelrod at the University of Chicago. In other interviews with Moore, Collins had promised that the federal government would never institute vaccine mandates. Yet during this interview with Moore, days before the Biden administration tried to force vaccines on the public via OSHA requirements, Collins argued for vaccine mandates, saying there's no doubt in his mind that they're legal. Here's a direct quote from Collins about mandates at that event. "Do they convince people who otherwise wouldn't elect to get them? Oh yeah, they clearly have, if it means losing your job." Moore offered no pushback or challenge to this assertion, and Collins went on to argue that it's a legitimate use of government power to threaten people resistant to getting the vaccine with job loss. The Supreme Court, it turned out, felt differently. On cloth face masks, Collins insisted that they are vital to stopping the spread of the virus, a claim that many other experts deny and that even the CDC has now backed away from. As he held up a cloth mask in a different YouTube video with Russell Moore, Collins said this.
"This is not a political statement. This is not an invasion of your personal freedom. This is a life-saving medical device. Think about it that way."
As late as September of last year, he was still arguing that young school children should be masked.
It troubles me greatly that somehow we've gotten in this big political debate about whether masks need to be worn in school for kids under 12 who can't be vaccinated, who could therefore get infected and could then spread it to others. If we don't have mask wearing in school, it's guaranteed we're going to have outbreaks. It's really too bad that it's turned into such a strange argument that's going on.
Again and again, the pastors and ministry leaders in these presentations echoed Collins in insisting that mask wearing wasn't just a medical issue, but a spiritual one. Here's Rick Warren describing it as a matter of obedience to Jesus.
You know, to me, Francis, wearing a mask is not a political statement. Wearing a mask is the great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. You know, one day Jesus is walking down the street and a guy walks up to him and says, Lord, what's the most important command in the Bible? And Jesus said, oh, that's easy. I can summarize the whole Bible in 2 sentences. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. It's all about love. And right now, the most practical way I can show love for my neighbor is wear a mask.
And only a few months ago, Collins was still voicing support for keeping churches closed, in line with the policies of authorities like California Governor Gavin Newsom. Throughout the pandemic, he insisted it was important for church members not to gather to worship.
Don't gather inside. That's particularly risky because that's where the airflow is not helping you.
While a few major evangelical pastors like John MacArthur in Los Angeles publicly stood against the government shutting down churches, many of the biggest names sided with Collins. In a joint interview with Collins, Tim Keller called churches who defied lockdowns the, quote, bad and ugly of good, bad, and ugly church responses to COVID.
Tim, talk about the church's response a little bit to all of this, the good, the bad, and the ugly, perhaps. What have you seen that makes you proud of the body of Christ? What are some things that perhaps we could be doing better?
There's been an extremely small percentage of churches that have defied government directives, and they are, because of the publicity they get, there seems to be far more than there really are. And that's the bad or the ugly.
World-famous British theologian N.T. Wright agreed with Collins that churches who refused to close were disturbing.
I have seen some fairly disturbing examples of people who really find that, the devil can't get into my church, so I'm safe while I'm there, or Jesus is my vaccine, so I don't need to worry right now.
That's just irresponsibility.
And in his interview with Collins, Warren suggested that pastors who resisted local or federal orders were doing so out of ego.
I am called by God as a shepherd to protect the flock that God has put under my care. And I am not willing to gamble the health of my members just so I can have a live audience to speak to. I'm sorry, my ego doesn't require that.
But perhaps the most controversial moments came when Collins used these Christian outlets to discredit the hypothesis that the virus originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. Leaked emails now show that Collins and his subordinate, Anthony Fauci, knew in February of 2020 that many experts believed COVID may have escaped from a Chinese facility. Yet only 2 months later, a Christianity Today live stream event framed the question as a conspiracy Collins roundly dismissed.
Here's a section of questions I'm calling skepticism and conspiracies. Let's start with the latter. How do we know this virus wasn't manufactured in a lab in China and released either intentionally or maybe accidentally instead of the story we get through the news?
There have been a lot of those conspiracy theories around. And, it was not a crazy idea when this first burst onto the scene to say, where did this come from? And particularly because there is a virology lab right there in Wuhan, some people wanted to jump to the conclusion there must be a connection there. Well, of course, there's virology labs in other places too. Now, if you look at the details, if you were trying to design a more dangerous coronavirus, you would never have designed this one. So I think one can say with great confidence that in this case, the bioterrorist was nature. Humans did not make this one, nature did.
After Collins made statements like this, leaders like Ed Stetzer wrote essays in Christian publications telling readers that to spread the lab leak hypothesis was to commit the sin of spreading conspiracy theories and gossip. In the meantime, despite new revelations that Anthony Fauci may have misled the public on COVID, Collins assured Christian audiences that they should trust Fauci's word.
Tony Fauci, who's been such a wonderful spokesperson for the truth of this.
So when Tony answers the question, listen carefully. Tony is a truth teller.
Yet for all his reputation for being a Bible-believing evangelical himself, Collins's public record should have made him a strange ambassador for the Biden administration to send to Christian communities. Even though Christianity Today described him as someone who believes in the sanctity of human life, his expressed views as head of the NIH fall far afield of most pro-lifers. He's not only defended experimentation on fetuses obtained by abortion, he's also directed record-level spending toward it. Among the priorities the NIH has funded under Collins, University of Pittsburgh projects that relied on the harvested organs of late-term aborted babies, potentially even including babies past term, up to 42 weeks of development. Pro-life activist David DeLeiden described some of this research on Fox News.
You can actually see the photographs in the published study of little baby scalps grafted onto the backs of lab rats growing little baby hairs. Those would have been the little hairs growing on the heads of little infants in Pittsburgh if they hadn't been killed by abortion and then stitched onto lab rats for experimentation.
Based on documents released by Judicial Watch, multiple physicians even charged Collins with giving grants to research that required extracting kidneys, ureters, and bladders from still living infants. Christina Francis, who chairs the American Association of Pro-Life Gynecologists, told Fox that based on the timing of tissue collection, the documents indicate, and I'm quoting here, that means that the baby is still alive at the time they're harvesting the tissue. When Nature magazine asked him about the Trump administration's decision to shut down fetal cell research, Collins made it clear he disagreed, saying, "I think it's widely known the NIH tried to protect the continued use of human fetal tissue. But ultimately, the White House decided otherwise, and we had no choice but to stand down." When Collins was asked by a University of Chicago student about research based on harvesting aborted baby organs, he admitted that he has knowingly decided to fund it. Moore, who again was the host of this event, has never mentioned Collins's position in any of his public statements recommending Christians should listen to Collins. But pro-life issues aren't the only way Collins diverges with the theologically Christian conservatives he was appealing to. In a letter he wrote to celebrate LGBT Pride Month, he declared himself an ally and advocate of the gay and trans movements, adding that he, quote, applauds the courage and resilience it takes for LGBTQ individuals to live openly and authentically. Now, this might not raise flags on its own, except that Collins personally promoted a new NIH initiative, launched under his watch, that specifically directed funding to controversial research related to, quote, sexual and gender minorities. On the ground, this has translated to awarding millions in grants to experimental transgender research on minors, like giving opposite-sex hormones to children as young as 8, and mastectomies to girls as young as 13. Another project awarded $8 million included recruiting teen boys to track their homosexual activities like, quote, condomless anal sex on an app without their parents' consent. Collins consistently maintains that he is not a political person, but merely a scientist. Yet at that University of Chicago event, he decried white evangelicals for supporting Trump, calling it a devil's bargain that has done, quote, great damage to the credibility of the church. Then he blamed the former president for causing COVID deaths. Collins said, quoting here, great harm was done to the people in this nation by a very, very self-involved and misguided president in the previous administration, and hundreds of thousands of people have died who should not have had to do so. When Collins officially retired from the NIH 3 months ago amid scandal over those leaked emails, evangelical pundit David French called him a national treasure. Russell Moore praised him as a model of, quote, Christian humility and grace. And in the Washington Post, Christian columnist Michael Gerson called him simply a truth seeker in the best sense. None of the Christian ministries, media outlets, or pastors featured in this report disclosed Collins' NIH record in their interviews with him. None have addressed his email scandal since then, nor have they responded to inquiries from the Daily Wire. My only other chance for answers came when I was able to schedule an interview with Collins himself. Unfortunately, as I sat down in our Zoom meeting, his team informed me he was running late. At 15 minutes past the appointed time, I received an abrupt notification that our interview had been canceled. The explanation for his cancellation came hours later when I received an email from a Collins spokesperson informing me that he'd decided to back out of our interview because he felt my reporting lacked a gracious tone. He didn't explain specifically what he objected to. On February 14th, a congressional committee announced that it is now investigating Collins and Fauci for deliberately suppressing information surrounding the lab leak hypothesis for politically driven purposes. 3 days later, Biden named Collins his new science advisor.